from a rather different angle, a little more empirical, not that that makes it better or worse, but to try and describe more what's happened to the rudiments of living, of making a life as a human being in South Africa, and to try and untease why that reality or those struts and pillars and building blocks of life look the way they do. And then finish off towards the end of it with an attempt to play with some of the possibilities that lie ahead. Like, essentially, it's a question which I'll phrase in the last section of this. Are we at a crossroads, or have we actually reached a dead end? And what are the kinds of factors that decide which of the two it is in South Africa? I'm hoping I'm going to have enough time at the end to talk sensibly about that. I'm also very jet lagged, so if I say things that seem odd to you, do an autocorrect and it'll work out at the end there. Okay, look, I was going to start off with the obligatory, all of this is not bad. And I'll run through a few of the things that have happened that are very, very important to bear in mind. We have a vibrant democracy, as stressed as it might be. We have a free press. We have gay rights enshrined in law and in the Constitution. We have abortion rights enshrined and used by women who feel capable without stigma of doing that. We have a Bantustan system which was beyond Orwellian in its intricacy and muddledness, which was dismantled very, very quickly. Its staff and functionaries absorbed into a new state. One of the stories of what happened, I think, lies in these functionaries and the types of people that ended up being absorbed into the new state. But I'm not going to get into that. There are any number of things we've achieved that I think are worthy of pride. We have a welfare system which is the envy of many so-called development countries in the world. Close to 17 million South Africans earn a piddling, but for them very important sum of money every month. Enables them to put some food on the table, pay for some things that help schools, kids go to school, and so on. And I can go on with this list. I take that as spoken, as accepted, and as understood. What matters to me is not that we haven't achieved some kind of equitable utopia in South Africa. The baseline, my bar is set a hell of a lot lower than that. What worries me, and this is what I'm going to focus on, is why we haven't achieved a society that offers a large enough number of citizens at least the prospect of a life that is slightly better than the one that their parents were. And that is unfortunately the reality of South Africa today. Life has gotten worse for a lot of South Africans, and there does not seem to be that realistic prospect that you can bequeath your children a better fate than the one you've had to endure. And the first 2-3 parts of this are going to be an attempt to cast some light on why that's been the case. Now, the first part, I think, requires us to look at what's happened to work. Work and the ability to earn a wage in South Africa. We have these three concepts of working, earning a wage, and having some claim to well-being or at least being shielded against utter precariousness. Those links were forced into a very rigid chain in South Africa, and quite early on as well. For more than a century, we've had a regime that has effectively corralled Africans into this regime of labor and of waged work, and it was the Bantustans were built on that. Before that, they were called the reserves, of course. And of course, this happened on extremely precarious terms. But at the heart of the system lay this constant, driven need that you had to work in order to survive. And it's one of the reasons why wage labor capitalism in South Africa pervades the economy to an extent much greater than most other economies in Africa. It's one of the reasons why we have such an atrophied informal sector in South Africa as well. You had to go and work for somebody in order to make it. But that chain, you work, you earn a wage, and there's a prospect of improvement of well-being, has been broken in South Africa for a very long time, before 1994. The shock is the extent to which it remains broken 20 years later. Now, at the moment, and that was the next graph here, that's what's happened to our employment rate. That's the employment rate, not the unemployment rate. I'm going to flash a lot of these slides at you, and they're going to be quite brief very often. The black line is South Africa. The international norm at the time of this slide, which as you can see is 2012, was around 60% employment rate. Of course, it's worse in some countries because of the global recession as well. But it's quite clear that South Africa, compared to two of its BRIC partners, Russia and Brazil, performs very, very poorly on that at least on that ranking there. This is a sense that you can get of what's happened to the employment rate since the democratic elections were held in 1994. There's a vast army of wageless people. Large parts of them have no prospect of waged work. Large parts of them, 1/3 of young Africans have never worked for a wage in their lives. By young, I'm talking up to around 24, 25 years of age. The expanded rate up there is the true, the rate you need to really be looking at. You get counted as employed, and this is the bottom line here, is the unemployment rate in the narrow definition. You get counted as employed in South Africa today if you wash cars, if you busk, and if you hunt for a living. So there's a bit of fiddling happening with the numbers, and it still gives us a rate of, it's averaged around 24, 25% over the past several years. Over the past 20 years, it's never been better than 22, 23% unemployment. The comparison there is quite obvious. You can see that in 94. The red is the narrow rate, the broad one is the expanded rate. So we have a situation where in the mid-2000s rather, there's a slight increase in jobs created. They get stripped out of the economy again with the 2009 recession. We lose 900,000 to 1 million jobs. And a fraction of those have returned. It enabled South African capital to a large extent to restructure its workforce in ways that had been quite difficult in some respects under the labor order that had been introduced in 1995 onwards. So we have deep structural unemployment. As I said to you, almost a third, and that's where the order correct had to come in. It's actually almost half of young Africans have never held a wage job in South Africa. We would need economic growth of about 6% GDP, annual growth, to create 5 million jobs by 2020. That was an estimate made in 2010. We average, as we'll see in a little while, at around about 2-3% in some of our best years. What's happened to wages? Those who can earn money, what are they earning? We have problems with data here, and there's a number of controversies surrounding them. But the reality of wage work right now, as in many other countries around the world, is you have a shrinking core of skilled, full-time employed workers, and this enlarged and vast army of surplus labor, which is sometimes drafted in to perform casual part-time work, outsourced work, often with no benefits, and the lucky ones would get some benefits in there. We are no different from a pattern that has asserted itself across economies around the world. What's happened to wage trends, though, is controversial. If you look at the average wage across all workers, it looks fairly okay, going back about 20 years. 2 to 3% growth rate of real wages earned there. It slows to around 0 in 2010, and then it starts spiking up and then. But the average wage would include some of the richest of us, some of the most skilled of us, and of course the very poorest. It doesn't tell us much about what the majority of South Africans are living through. And what you discover when you look at low-wage income earners in South Africa is a drop, a collapse of real wages of 20% measured back to the mid-1990s. Of course, a large part of that is accounted for the fact that people only intermittently manage to find work that would pay them a wage as well. So workers without tertiary qualifications suffered a drop of about 20% of their average real wage between 1995 and the late 2000s. Trade unions have struggled to try and hold the line on this. They are fighting a losing battle for reasons that I can't get into detail with you here. So how do you survive if this is the reality? Well, of course, you try and put yourself into the market in the most elementary possible ways, as these men here do. But you also draw on those in your kinship circles, family, friends who do have some money to share with you in the form of loans and otherwise. So remittances become a massively important part of surviving in South Africa. The strange thing for me is there's very little data about the extent to which remittances change, how much people are managing to get from it. Very little data and understanding as well about the mechanics of repaying these debts and so on. A great lacuna in South Africa. I don't know whether it's the case elsewhere in the world, but we know it's very important. The other part is touched upon in this graph here. In the 1990s, the welfare system, and its little grand title for it at the time, was totally restructured in South Africa. It was still very small. Around about 2.5 million people were earning something that you would call welfare in the form of a child support grant or a pension or a disability grant and so on. But that, for reasons that should be obvious, given the kind of reality I've described to you, ballooned after that. So but by 2012, we have around 17 million South Africans who draw a grant at some point in a year. Most of this are child support grants. About 90% of these grants are child support grants. They're worth about 35 Canadian dollars a month. The rest is divided up between disability grants and pensions. A pension averages at around 130, 135 Canadian dollars a month. The shocking thing is this is not money that the pension owner, the mother in the case of the child support grant, actually spends on his or herself. This is divided up amongst those around her as well. I think it defies me to understand how you divide up $35 between a few people to try and keep life sustainable. But this has had a significant impact on poverty. It is probably the only tool that the ANC government has managed to introduce that has reduced the depth, the sheer severity of poverty levels. And that's what you see in this graph here. The blue line up there is what these income levels are like with the grants. The red lines are what they would have liked. These are income deciles, by the way, so that's the second poorest, third poorest, what it would have been like over the period. And do I have the period there? Yes, up to 2010, were it not for these grants. These are lifesavers, as small and as insignificant as they might seem. Large numbers of households still slip between the cracks here. There are about 40% of South African households who have no, households, not individuals, who have no regular access to a waged income. So they have to get this money from somewhere else. About 17%, close to 20% of South Africans have no regular access to a waged income or an income grant, a cash grant such as this. They have to find money coming from somewhere else. It is a horrifying reality to have to endure. Why do they slip between the grants, given the extent to which the system has expanded? The reasons are many, but I think a fundamental one is that the system is structured on a great fiction, which is one perhaps not unfamiliar to Canadians nowadays as well. It's the idea that you only have the right to get a grant if you are basically not able to work for a wage. So you get it because you are a child, the child support grant, you're too young to work, you get it because you are too old to work, you're on pension, or you're too ill or suffer other infirmities, you get a disability grant. So in a country with an economy with 35+% unemployment, we have a welfare system that functions basically on the assumption that everybody else can find work were they to just get on their bike and go and take a look for it. I had a short section on whether this system could be any better, and I'm going to leave it for questions. It can, and I will controversially suggest that Brazil in the 1990s up to the mid-2000s offers one example of a very modest alternative that doesn't require bucking any real system. It just requires having, I think, a set of ambitions that are a little more lofty than the ones that the ANC seemed occupied by at the time. South Africa's spending on social provision is quite low compared to Brazil, Russia, and of course it's much lower than it is in the so-called high-income countries. Now, second part of this is what kind of economy generates this reality where you cannot viably offer work to a third or more of workers in it. Dan has touched on some of this, and you'll forgive me for sounding like an echo chamber in some respects here, but I think it's important to remember that we have an economy that is largely structured still, to said in Marikana film last night quite clearly as well, around minerals extraction, so resource extraction, energy sectors attached to that, and over the past 15, 20 years, a massive, an absolutely gargantuan financial sector that is attached to that as well. This is really what our economy is structured around. The industrialization that occurred in South Africa was haphazard, never ever driven by anything that deserves being called a cogent strategy. These were little fitful entrepreneurial forays that were supported by state subsidies which disappeared as quickly as they emerged from one year to the next. What we've seen in the new liberal adjustment period is a solid process of deindustrialization as well, especially in the manufacturing sector. So that's kind of the economy that was inherited in the way in which it's very nutshell way described, developed over the past 20 years. But let's go back to the early 1990s. The economy that the ANC is looking at with some degree, I think, of of mystification and bewilderment, was not performing very well. It was largely, as we know, in the hands of whites, and it was dominated by a handful really, of massive conglomerates that straddled various sectors that occupied practically every rung in the value chain going up and down because they couldn't move their money anywhere else. Sanctions, divestment, and a number of other factors trapped South African capital in the country. And as Dan said quite pointedly, they were desperate to get their money out of the country. Not to just go and live in a chalet somewhere or in Monaco and play the tables, but to be able to participate in this massive global market opportunity that everybody else was being able to jump into. So capital's fundamental position was a set of arrangements, political and economic, that enabled them to restructure, to unbundle their holdings, to restructure and go and play. And man, have they managed to do that. They are playing with the world's best at the moment. South African Breweries is one of half a dozen companies that are world beaters in the sense of being able to become absolutely global giants in the global economy. So what they achieved, what they managed to do is what Jill Hart has called, they denationalized themselves. They sundered the bonds between their money and their assets and this place called South Africa, this idea of a South African nation that, and you'll hear an echo of this in a couple of minutes when I finish off, that I think has great important resonance still in us understanding how politics works in South Africa. I'm not going to get into the details of the new liberal restructuring that occurred because it's rather tedious, I think, although fascinating to those of us who like reading the fine print. But the upshot of 20 years of structural adjustment in South Africa, which has gone through, I think, 3 distinct phases, none of which changed its basic underlying character. The upshot of this are a number of adjustments that were facilitated. The one, as I said, was corporate unbundling and restructuring. The other was massive capital flight, legal and illegal, and divestment. Vast amounts of capital left South Africa. It is not new, it happened before 1994 as well, but the volumes as estimated as percentages of GDP that left South Africa after 94 kept increasing. It reached by one estimate above 20% in 2007. It's a controversial piece of data, but I don't think it's far off the track. We had the globalization of South Africa's largest corporations occurring. We had, as I said, this turbocharged financial sector emerging, and an economy basically wrenched open for international speculative capital. I want to just touch on a couple of points. I've mentioned the extent to which capital was leaving the country. The degree to which South Africa's economy has been financialized is quite impressive, if this sort of thing impresses you. In 1994, we had the financial sector accounting for around 6.5% of GDP. 1994. By 2009, it was 20% of GDP. It is an exceptionally unusually large financial sector in a middle-income country structured as South Africa's is. But it has a massive influence on what happens to money. And as we will see in a second, capital in South Africa tends not to be invested in zones or activities that can produce jobs for a number of reasons that are familiar to, I think, many other economies and societies in the world. We're going to come to that in a second, though. So that, in a sense, is, I think, the main package of legacies of the structural adjustment of South Africa's economy. Has that generated growth for us? Well, the growth rates in South Africa have been poor for a long time. This takes us back to the 1950s. And I'm rushing. If you look at your 2% mark over here, you'll see that from around about the early 1970s, we really haven't cleared that with any gusto at all. And these flat lines give you the average trends over those periods over there. So we've run certainly under the global average when things were going well for low and other middle income countries. And we've done so quite dramatically as well. If you look at this slide, South Africa is the black here. And these are, again, the people whose company we crave amongst the BRICS. And we have underperformed by a significant margin when it comes to sheer GDP growth. It's not even the quality of the growth, it's not even its social implications, it's just making the economy grow, which is a fundamental need in order to achieve many of these other goals that we're seeing are not being met. So as I said, money capital is not being invested in South Africa nearly to the extent that it should and can be. That slide merely confirms that to you. Your line that matters here is usually the 20% of GDP. That's roughly what an economy needs to be investing in fixed capital formation if it is to achieve a reasonable pattern or trend of growth in the economy. And you see what's happened to South Africa. It's stuck down here, and there's no sign of this changing anywhere soon. That would affect largely your manufacturing sector and the other more sophisticated sectors of the economy. Another shocking part of what's happened is in the agricultural sector, which has practically imploded since the mid-1980s in here. And a whole story lies behind that and the failure of land reform, which I'm not going to have time to go into. The upshot of this is a simple reality here, is that roughly a third of South Africans live on less than $2 a day. This runs up to 2009. I'm pretty sure this runs up to 2009, yes. This drop here happens largely to an increase in employment and the expansion of cash grants over here. I don't have the data after that, but it's likely to have stretched out a little bit again to over 35, 36% in there. That is effectively what we're left with. The inequality trends are not strictly determined by race anymore in South Africa, but there's no denying the extent to which it shapes your chances of having a reasonably dignified life or not. Anybody who told you in 1994 that whites would be this much better off when it comes to salary and other forms of income would probably have been laughed out of the room. That's the way it looks there. The other big winners have been people of so-called Asian descent as well. This black line captures African incomes and so-called colored incomes as well. For some reason, the people producing this draft didn't actually include bars for colored incomes. So there's been a slight increase, but it's at a level that pales in comparison with the rest. Income inequality, I know you're aware of this, has worsened in South Africa. It's not the only place this has happened, but the extent of it is extraordinary. It defies belief, in fact. You think of the Gini coefficient as being a bit like a golf handicap, so that the lower your score, the better you're doing. South Africa is at 0.7 at this point. This is about 3 years ago. If it were 1.0, it meant one person pocketed the entire income in the country. We were at 0.7, right? And it's gotten worse since 1994 as well. Now, the final section here. What does this mean? Is it a crossroads? Is it a dead end? Is it, this, in my book suggested that, have we actually pushed the system to the limit where something has to give or not? I don't know the answer to that, but what I wanted to touch on is share with you some thoughts about how a party how a party manages to retain authority and reproduce authority, and more importantly, consent as well, given these kind of material and lived realities that it presides over. And given the fact that after 20 years, it cannot realistically point to any trend of this reality changing in a significant way. There are efforts to alleviate some of the damage experienced by people, but there's no trend that you can say things are getting better, hang in, it will get better if you stick with us. The one way of coping as a political entity, as a political force, of course, is you try and fling around band-aids, and that is effectively what our welfare system is. There was enormous resistance within the Treasury and the people, the commissars of our finances, to expanding the South African welfare system up until the early 2000s already. Enormous resistance. It was laughed out of the room when it was suggested, but they understood the political importance of it, and they managed to increase it to the point described earlier. The other thing you do is you blame it on somebody else. And really that's how we need to understand Zuma and Mbeki's great spectacle. It was something of a pantomime towards the end. But it really was born of this understanding in the ANC that there is great frustration and insecurity out there, a real sense among South Africans that things were spinning apart. And part of that was fed, as Dan quite correctly pointed out, by what had happened to the HIV response of the ANC, to the extent there was a response in the 2000s. I can talk at length to you about that. That's the field I work in and have been for the last 15 years. And it's a story unto itself. But the main function of this battle was to get the ANC off the hook, to buy it some time in which it could recuperate and come up with a plan. And the ANC needed a fall guy, and really Thabo Mbeki kind of fits the bill pretty perfectly. You know, a tetchy man, aloof, a sense of own worth and intellectual capacity that doesn't exactly go over very well on people who like this type of political figure, and who value the very important thing signified by a leader, that he is a man of the people, one who understands ordinary people, etc., not formally educated to the extent that Mbeki was, and so on. So the idea, the selling job done in 2006, 2008, was that Jacob Zuma and those he gathered around him would restore this story of liberation. They would restore the continuity of this narrative that the ANC had positioned itself at the center of. As Dan said very, very, very importantly, the ANC never was really at the center of that story up until the I would say late 1970s, really. It's one of its great achievements is how it locates itself there and then stays there to the point where when a political negotiation has to be achieved, they are the go-to people and nobody else matters, really. But this is the narrative that the ANC has to continue, and Zuma gave it the opportunity to do that. Zuma's victory, at least. There have been some policy shifts, but the basic undercarriage, basic underpinnings of the transition have remained the same. What has changed? Corruption is most, I hesitate to say worse because I have no baseline to test it against. It's certainly more visible, it's more brazen, it seems more ambitious almost, the extent to which people are willing to be corrupted and to corrupt others. But part of the story of why it's in the news so much is, comes later, because it ties into what's happened to the ANC internally as well. But the disgruntlement, the disquiet has very, very quickly revived. Now, yet, when South Africans go to the polls, this sort of thing happens. I know you've heard that, yes, the ANC is losing support, of course it's losing support, but it still won 249 out of 400 seats earlier this year, and there really is no other game in town. I'm not going to stand here and disparage the Democratic Alliance, they center-right, and I'll leave it at that. There are three stories here that I think are important. I'm going to use this laser thing, but I'm at a bad angle. The one is this, basically a pop-up party, the Economic Freedom Fighters of Julius Malema, and it really pops up out of nowhere. We don't know what will happen to it. Does it survive, manage to build or not? But it is in a sense an expression of the degree to which there is no alternative open to voters who do want to exercise their democratic right. The other big story is what happened here to the Inkatha Freedom Party. And there's a hugely important trend that is implied by those numbers there. This party has practically disappeared. And it didn't happen just on its own accord because it stopped showing up at work every day. This has been part of a very, very determined effort by the ANC to consolidate a rural base for itself. And this, in effect, was its laboratory where it achieved it, in a place where nobody thought it was possible 20 years to do that. The rebuilding, the replenishing of power, control, and authority in rural areas in South Africa is probably the big tactical reaction of the ANC over the past 10 years. It's not going to be enough to solve any of the other problems. In fact, it doesn't even touch on them. But it will explain, I think, some of the trends we'll see in elections in the years to come. So we have an ANC that wins quite handsomely with around about 62% of the vote. We have this man who manages to win 25 seats in Parliament. And that's the trend in there, in voter support for the ANC. The top line is the one that the newspapers report on. The bottom line is the really important one, because that is quite disturbing. If you are in the ANC, you will be losing a bit of sleep over that. That's the percentage of people who are of voting age who bother to show up and vote for you. We have a system that requires you to register, and then you vote. So roughly 1/3 of people who can vote bothered to vote for the ANC earlier this year. I'll give you a comparative example. In the presidential elections in Brazil right now, it's close to 40% of the voting age population actually voted for Dilma Rousseff in there. So the company is rather esteemed when it comes to this kind of turnout. That's just to show you the discrepancy in turnout as well. Because the question is whether this over here, what that means. The folk who don't bother to show up and vote for you. What do we know about them? And the truth is the ANC knows a fair bit about them because they spend enormous amounts of money on polling and surveys constantly throughout the year. I have a good friend who does it and he'll never tell me exactly what they're finding, so I guess it doesn't make him such a good friend. We do know that a large part of this stay away vote, or non-vote, is amongst young voters. These are folk who just not bothering to register at all. A part of it is people who lack the documentation to vote. Let's not forget about that as well. It's very difficult if you don't have a birth certificate to manage to convince the system that you exist and can vote and so on. But this here, can I have 5 more minutes because I wouldn't touch that one thing. This here is just an extent of your youth unemployment. So if these are the people who are staying away in large numbers from voting for you, they're not at work as well. And the reality that occurs on the basis of that, I'll talk about this slide when in discussion. It's a very, very important slide that casts a bit of cold water on the idea of a rebellion of the poor. But the reality is this though. A series of protest actions that just grows and grows every single year in South Africa. The 2013 numbers were, I think, by the 7th or 8th month of the year when this was compiled. So these so-called service delivery protests are pervasive, they're endemic, and there is a clear trend of people not just being willing to grumble amongst each other, but to get out and do something about it, even if it means protesting and venting it in a very visible and dramatic way. The question I think this leaves us with is, does this kind of reaction signify a force, or hint at a force, that is capable to steer the ANC onto a different track? The ANC's biggest problem, as I suggested earlier, is how does it retain consent and legitimacy in this kind of reality, when there's this really palpable sense of unfairness afoot. Winning elections is not a problem for it. It's got a fairly strong brand still. It spends a lot of money on election campaigns. It is able to cajole and force and convince very, very effectively at grassroots level as well through the use of state resources, combined with any number of other tactics parties use at grassroots level and so on. But it's got to do more than that. It has to somehow, given the material reality over which it presides, it has to assemble a normative framework, a framework of values that resonates, that means something to people, that enables people to look at what they see around them, what they live, and still not reject the ANC, to see it as a possible harbinger of better days just around the corner. And this is what I want to finish off with, is to just share with you a few rather haphazard thoughts around this, because I think this is a neglected part of understanding South Africa, this ideological, this discursive dimension of life there. They have to create this moral map, and they have to connect it with practical politics in ways that are real for people, or feel real for people. Now, this is a complex process. It's very contradictory. It has to constantly be remade and adapted and done on the hoof, so to speak. But these are the things that help us make sense of our own past, our own present, and the own future that we imagine for ourselves. They're the maps we use to orient ourselves in life, decide where our allegiances go, our loyalties lie, and when we sever those links. The fundamental reference point for this in South Africa remains that of nationalism, and quite specifically African nationalism. I think we are doing ourselves a disservice if we neglect the extent to which the idea of a South African nation and all the other sometimes very unpleasant or prickly categories that feed into this idea of a nation, the ideas of who actually belongs in South Africa, who is an authentic South African, on what terms are they such, who has entitlements and rights, and who draws the lines between these various contests that inevitably emerge from this kind of discourse. I think this is a fundamental part, not just of public discourse in South Africa, but of lived life in South Africa. If not consciously, subconsciously, we are doing this every single day as a South African. And it doesn't matter what class, race, or other category you find yourself in. It is how you orient yourself in society and think about yourself in terms of a future. So nationalism, I think, retains enormous currency. We're caught in this force field of it still. It is something that Thabo Mbeki tried to diffuse with his now folly of African Renaissance, of an African century and so on. But he tried to bring together this idea of a modern, forward-looking nationalism that's capable of engaging in this world, of a globalized world, which is a sundering world. It's a world that is not lodged in any one place to the extent that it had been 50 years before. And he failed. You know, I disparaged him at some point in writing as being a cross between Kwame Nkrumah and Tony Blair, but I think it captured what he was trying to do in there. And X marks the spot where we left right now. It is on that failure to somehow reconcile the tension between a moral order, a moral map, which looks backwards at where we come from and came from, which is a very felt look, a very emotional look, and that looks forward at the same time at where we want to go and on what terms we do it. That looks inward at who belongs, what unity do we build in South Africa, and that looks outward because nationalism always expels somebody, it always banishes somebody. I think these are the big battles that lie ahead here. The pogroms against foreigners were a sign of these kinds of things being played out practically. And I'll leave with this, Linda, leave with this thought. I shudder when I think of the extent to which that frame of discourse equips the ANC to continue regenerating and replenishing loyalty and consent to it. The extent to which these categories of authenticity, of ethnic identity and racial identity are there to be used by an increasingly desperate ruling political party, I don't think are quite appreciated enough at the moment. There are, despite the uprising protests and so on, I think a lot of cards the ANC will play. One of them is that, we saw the movie last night, violence is an increasingly important, underreported. This was a grand, an epic example of it. And one of the most horrifying that, I was saying to somebody last night, I do not recall the apartheid regime gunning down workers at a protest like Marikana ever. But violence on a day-to-day basis, violence used by the state, violence withheld by the state, is constantly being used as a lever for control in there. The ability of the ANC and its willingness to use this capacity to exercise or not exercise violence selectively, linking it to the various feuds and battles that go on in trying to command resources at the local state level, get access to a state contract and tender, take revenge on somebody who managed to win the ticket onto a ward list in a local election and so on, cannot be underestimated. What it makes for is an increasingly fratricidal and divided party, presiding over a material reality I've described to you, which is one no political governing party, I think, would want to be presiding over. It makes for a low-intensity crisis, I think. Whether we emerge from it in a better state than we are today, I think depends on what happens with these energies, which continue to be indefatigable in South Africa. They do not, however, as I said to John over breakfast this morning, add up to the likely sum of their parts by any stretch of imagination. I don't care whether the graph of local government protests keeps rising up. Until we find a way to connect these into an actually challenging force politically and ideologically, I think we're stuck where X marks the spot, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you. We've taken up most of the discussion time, so with your approval, I'd like to cut short the coffee time. I think it's valuable to have questions now after these two extraordinary talks. Now, I wonder if when you are recognized, if you will identify who you are. Questions? Somebody put the lights on. Yeah, that's great. Questions? Questions? Yes.
I'll direct my question to...
And who are you? Could you identify yourself, please?
Sure, I'm Andres from the University of Ottawa. So my question is for both of you, and I think you'll have very different answers. What do you think needs to happen to, fix the gap between rich and poor, end all tensions between blacks and whites, that sort of thing? Like, what do you think needs to happen?
All questions.
Yeah. We're going to take another one, John Saul.
Well, I thought that Dan's look at the way in which the Bretton Woods Agreement on the one hand and the gradual coming together around a shared project in effect, although very lumpily so, between the National Party and the ANC was well handled. I think there's an intermediate reality which may run the risk of being conspiratorial in Dan's eyes, but I'm just wondering what the role of domestic capital in South Africa is. Last night I quoted Biko as saying we could have a false decolonization in South Africa quite easily, because the black middle class in the making is recruitable to that kind of an outcome. But in fact, race holds us back as a possibility. I offer the hypothesis that Biko was wrong because he overvalued black consciousness as an answer and underestimated the extent to which, in fact, capital could do that kind of a false decolonization. And I think I then quoted, or suggested we could quote Oppenheimer in the 70s, Zach de Beer and Malcolm Fraser, for example, on behalf of the Commonwealth, Gavin Relly, etc., saying we have to do a deal with the ANC in order to safeguard capital in South Africa. And I'm just wondering where that set of variables, intermediary between your broader picture, fits as well. One point. Secondly, I think that I was very pleased that you talked about the needs of the UDF, because it remains the one very understudied reality in South Africa. Rusty Bernstein said that was the turning point for him and for the South African Revolution, when in fact the ANC consciously co-opted, as they did also COSATU, and also then the UDF. They had the UDF dissolve itself, but with a lot of contestation within the UDF over that happening, because there were people in the UDF who said, we must keep alive the UDF to keep an eye on the ANC. Well, that doesn't square with what the ANC wanted to see happen. So I think that whole question of where that energy has gone, whether that now is what we see in terms of the moves by Irvin and Jim and NUMSA to leave the alliance, the kinds of rebellion of the poor that might or might not, as Hein correctly says, add up into something real, is also a question. Where does this lead in terms of the aftermath, if you like, of the demise of the UDF, and in effect the co-optation of COSATU, and is undermining by the changing structure of the working class in South Africa as well? Because most of the workers, and even though they're a smaller percentage ever of the population, are not in the unions. They are in fact contractual and semi-employed, et cetera, et cetera. Who speaks for them? Who speaks for all the people who are left out of this? And Hein began to talk about that. But maybe if in this workshop as a whole, we could think about what it looks like to create a counter-hegemony that could begin to undermine the nationalist grip that the ANC at the top still has over the political system.
Okay, Carolyn Bassett.
Carolyn Bassett.
Thanks.
If I could, thanks both of you who have confirmed arguments that I've made, so I love both of you too. I'm wondering if Hein might speculate a little bit on whether you think anything interesting is going to come out of the 2016 municipal elections. Because I've been trying to get a bit of a handle on that. If we're going to see, not the grip of the ANC at the top necessarily fall apart, but perhaps some interesting things, fragmented, contradictory, much more at the local level. And I understand the ANC itself is very concerned about that possibility.
Okay, we've got 3 questions. I think we'll stop there. I've got 3 more coming up.
first this time.
Easy question first. It's going to come up as we speak to some of the others, but not in any way in which fits on a bumper sticker. Okay. Else I wouldn't be sitting here. The role of South African capital, I think, is, let me say, my sense of it is that it's under-researched at the moment. We tend to do the lazy thing, and I'm probably more guilty than most here, of just talking about South African capital, right? But of course it's not that simple. And there are definitely tensions between the interests of different sectors of South African economy playing out constantly. I think one of the more interesting examples of this is exactly around the platinum mining industry, the mining industry in general. And I want to suggest to you an article that Gavin Capps published in the Review of African Political Economy in 2012 at CAPPS, where he analyzed the evolution of a bill that the South African government managed to get passed called the Minerals Development Bill with respect to the platinum industry. And it's perhaps a cheat, John, in answering your question this way, but I think it gives great insight into the way in which capital was able to mobilize itself. All of mining capital came together very, very quickly and in a very sophisticated and powerful way to fundamentally change what this bill looked like and ended up doing in the mining industry. So the upshot of it is that the interests do not always conform across the board. And there are, and we always say this, there are rooms to exploit these tensions. I do not believe the ANC is remotely sophisticated enough in terms of its strategic capacity to do this. And so I don't hold up much hope for us using those gaps in there. The protests, I'll answer this and touch on Carolyn's. I think the 2016 local government elections are going to be an absolute eye-opener. And I cannot even predict in what ways, except, as you were suggesting, things just happening that we did not expect to see happen. I again want to suggest to you another book to read if you are still of the reading sort, and it's Jill Hart's most recent book, because she does something that requires an enormous amount of determination and perseverance, which is to go to a part of a country and go to it year after year after year and try and understand what's happening there, and to connect it to the national, to connect it to the global. And when you read her, and particularly her most recent book, I think you get a fantastic sense of the sheer ferment of possibility that is there at the local level. Let me just finish off with one remark, though. I'm very reluctant to romanticize these so-called service delivery protests. They are not all just about angry people getting together, organizing against a local official or party leader. They are used very consciously in some cases by people within the ANC in order to settle beefs and disputes, in order to position themselves for a particular ambition or contract or whatever. There's a lot of evidence of this happening. So when we add up these numbers, let's just bear that in mind. There is real energy and disquiet being expressed in them, but they are also not as innocently progressive works of the people as we wish them to be.
Yeah, the first question I have no answer to except a glib one. Invent a time machine, go back to 1976 and give me total power. But I will reply to that more seriously by trying to come to terms with the important points John raises. I think the first thing is, I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy theory, John. I don't think we should ever be surprised that capital thinks strategic, has always done so and will continue to do so, and has far greater resources at its command to enable it to do so. So I don't, that people who are linked to capitalist interests are thinking how to protect their interests in the long term is, to me, neither strange nor outrageous. The problem is that we're not doing so. Which brings me to your other comment. I don't buy the concept of recolonization at all. I think that we're in an entirely new period, and I think that just adding the prefix "re" to something that happened in a very different phase of human history, where the logic of colonization had nothing to do with the logic of new forms of domination established Now, I mean, this is what I'm talking about, the need to think in terms of new concepts. But then your key question is, how do we create a counter-hegemony? I think we need to go beyond that. If we can dream in Technicolor tomorrow, a new counter-hegemonic force that involves civil society and some kind of political party with vast popular support and a coherent program manages to get itself elected in 2019. Two fundamental problems remain, and these are the two fundamental problems that, over and above what I mentioned, cripple the ANC. First is financing elections. Where de Klerk was right is that one of the things the ANC had to do in reinventing itself as a political party in 1990 to 1994, it had to mobilize the immense financial resources to contest and win an election. It was a group that had never done so before. And it established links to capital, yes, but according to what a very close friend of mine, currently a minister in the government, told me, it was mainly Indonesia and Saudi Arabia that functioned the Mandela's election campaign in 1994. That, as we are rediscovering in Quebec, despite René Lévesque's wonderful electoral law, has problems, because who finances a political party is the person who calls the shot, and the ANC has never declared, even to its own national executive, where its financing comes from. Treasurer General probably communicates that information to the President General of the ANC, but nobody else in the ANC knows who's financing. That's the first thing it's got to deal with. The second thing that it's got to deal with, let us dream in Technicolor that this party, without corrupting itself, mobilizes sufficient economic resources to win the election and takes office. Notice I didn't say power. Because Hein mentioned in passing, the crucial thing is then, one thing to be a political party, as we know, political science 101, a very different thing to be the governing party in a state which has a long historical trajectory and path-dependent thinking on the part of its functionaries. And unless you essentially shoot the entire bureaucracy, you're going to still be trapped with those considerations. So the left has not begun to deal with it. We have to think beyond a counter-hegemonic project. We have to think, what does power mean and how do we counter that power? And this, I want to come on to a point that the only thing that I slightly disagreed with Hein's presentation was the ideology of nationalism. I wouldn't frame it like that. I think that the enduring electoral popularity of the ANC is down not just to its historical legacy and its deserved historical legacy, but it's also down to the fact that in that extract that I read at the beginning of my talk, there is a national question in South Africa. You might not like it, particularly white Marxists might not like that to frame it like that, but there is a national question. So long as the principal determinant of one's life chances in South Africa remains the color of one's skin and nothing else, the national question, I wouldn't call it nationalism, anybody who harps on that has a built-in political base. It's why the DA is dead in the water and will never get anywhere. It cannot contest, it cannot develop credibility around the national question. I don't think Malema's kind of fascist politics we can do so either. So that there is this vast block. And you know, I used to my students in Quebec an analogy to make this thing real to them. The ANC and the Parti Québécois are essentially similar beasts. Well, the ANC has a much longer and more glorious history. And that is that they were founded as a broad social alliance to deal with an essential, pressing, and vital social problem. They came to power and they addressed some of the fundamentals of that problem. And having done so, they are casting around to maintain a purity and maintain a faith with the original vision. René Lévesque would be horrified at the Parti Québécois of today, or as I call it, the Parti Québécois, as it's soon to become. The ANC has become the same. I said that Mandela's secretary, one of his mistakes was not to have chosen Cyril Ramaphosa. I didn't name him. Somebody sitting in this room told me in 1985, when Cyril Ramaphosa first came to visit the Canadian Trade Union Congress, that he was, quote, the real deal. Well, he turned to be somebody else's real deal. You know, I mean, a man can spend 40 million rand on buying a bull. The question is then, How do you develop a political leadership, a political movement that can not just mobilize support in the run-up to an election, but has a real functional strategy to deal not just with a state bureaucracy, but with globalization and South Africa's declining place in the global economic order?
Okay.
Was it me or
No,
Mark?
it's Mark.
Oh,
Mark,
sorry.
can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so
Can
great
you
to-
introduce yourself? please?
Mark Upright, Queens. Yeah, so nice to hear such a clearly articulated left perspective, and I'm just going to compare it slightly to the conference in Oxford, where I would have to say it was kind of center right, and the Goldman Sachs people presented their analysis there, and we heard people talking about the way forward as getting rid of labor legislation and going for a low-wage export-oriented economy to compete with Bangladesh, I suppose. So thank you for that. But I would just have to say one thing is missing from both presentations, this one in Oxford, is South Africa is a physical place, and there's a geography in which it is located. And maybe, Hein, you can put in a slide next time that shows maybe, I don't know if it can be calculated, but the environmental costs that are in this model and where we're going, because every single prediction is saying this is like not looking good. Water shortages and all that sort of thing. Consumption of gas, I should say coal, etc. is all, that's not being questioned. Is there any way, talking about this blue sky thinking or whatever, to bring that into the thinking as a way forward and bringing in environmental consciousness somehow to build a movement?
I'm Melissa Armstrong here at Carleton.
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Melissa Armstrong here at Carleton. I have a question for you, Dan. I was wondering if you think, because I mean, when I'm looking through some of the archive stuff with the ANC, I don't see anything with the urban strikes. Like, I feel like not only were they not prepared, I feel like they missed it. Like they forgot, like they didn't see it at all, it didn't happen. And the first time that they were really awakened to anything happening in South Africa is in '76, when they finally get an influx of people. Like they only really figured even, I feel like 76, because they got people from it. And I read even an argument that came through because the PAC wasn't ready to deal with the huge numbers. And so the ANC kind of got lucky in some senses from the timing and from their own structures. And so I'm wondering, can you comment on how the ANC saw itself at that time? Like, is it a liberation movement or is it a political party? Like, was it ready to be, was it imagining itself as a political party at that time? And at what time did it shift to imagining itself as political or taking over in South Africa? At what point does it do that?
And then, yes, you had your hand up, no, the one right in there. Did you not want to speak? Me? No, the person next to you, did you have a question? No. Okay, sorry, Toby, could you identify yourself?
Hein, I wanted to know if you could provide a little more information about that slide on the state of agriculture, because there were huge drops in the levels of production, and yet I guess I'm wondering if you have any sense of the degree to which that is capital flight. You have Mozambique, Angola, and Zambia luring South African farmers onto land that they're paying, I think, a 20th of the price per hectare for, and South African capital has, to some degree, and it's difficult to know how the scope of it, but they have moved into feed market, seed market, and varying inputs, and I'm wondering how that would be accounted for, accommodated for, both in that graph, but then it also, I guess, problematizes this whole notion of South African state and the attachment of capital and whiteness and white power from that.
Okay, I've got you down for the next and last set. We've got 3 more, and well, maybe 4 more. Okay, over to you.
May I go first? Yeah, of course. Is it Melissa?
Melissa,
Yeah, hi. Yeah, you're quite right. The ANC was entirely ignorant of almost everything that was going on in South Africa. I mean, from, I would say, the failure of the Wankie campaign, which was its attempt to infiltrate guerrillas into the country through what was then Rhodesia, until the Soweto uprising. And your question poses a semantic issue. When we talk about the ANC, in inverted commas, what do we mean by it? Because at that stage, the ANC was a number of small little things. The ANC in Africa, the ANC presence in Africa, particularly around Tambo, who was the functioning President General at the time, was fundamentally concerned with securing legitimacy and support from the members of then the Organization of African Unity, which was an exceptionally hard struggle, and the ANC was probably losing that fight with the PAC by that stage. In London, where the ANC presence was almost exclusively white and or / I hate these terms, but there's no way around them, Indian South Africans. There were two people in particular who were beginning to grapple with some of the long-term consequences of what was happening in South Africa, Joe Slovo and Ruth First. But apart from when I arrived in Britain in 1972, reading the ANC's journals was like, oh my God, it's as bad here as the little occasional propaganda piece that gets distributed in South Africa. Totally disconnected with the country. You're right, Soweto was the defining moment, and it should not be forgotten that there was immense rage. The students of Soweto, with regard to the ANC, you guys have allegedly been involved in an armed struggle for 16 years. Where the hell were you when the police opened fire on it? And the ANC was forced to acknowledge we were nowhere. And they started to push people into the country without training. Solomon Klongo was the first victim of that. Somebody should never been sent in with no real mission and killed a white worker and then was hanged himself for that. So there was this desperate attempt to capture for itself some kind of legitimacy because it was trapped in the armed struggle mode, which meant you were going to infiltrate guerrillas. I won't give to you, probably know, a long litany of pathetic attempts with the boats from Swaziland, from Somalia and all of that, to get people into the country. It was a real logistic problem. The other big change, fundamental, hugely important, was the independence of Mozambique. Because Frelimo was, until March 1994, the ANC's major African ally. And access to Mozambican territory changed the ballgame for the ANC. It didn't change the way the organization thought, or leading cadres in the organization thought about the struggle. And again, Slovo and First were the exceptions. They weren't the rules. And Slovo had to be very careful, because although he had immense credibility as the co-founder with Nelson Mandela of Umkhonto we Sizwe, and although he was the effective head, not the titular head, but the effective head of Umkhonto we Sizwe, he remained a white person who was not even born in South Africa. So he had to be seen to be acting within what was said to be legitimate in the organization. Slovo was the only member, so far as I know, after the death of Ruth, assassination of Ruth, Slovo was the only member of the leadership of the South African Communist Party and the ANC who actually started to take seriously the need to analyze changes in South African capitalism. None of the others did so. And he actually wrote, he was the author of those 2 paragraphs that I read out to you.
Hein, do you want to come in?
Not on that, but it says it all. On the environmental question, absolutely, thanks for reminding me. I can't claim to overlook it all the time. I have a section in my book that looks exactly at it. In a nutshell, South Africa, measured per capita, is one of the worst despoilers of the environment on the planet. And there's no sign of that stopping. I mentioned earlier a resource extractive-based economy with a huge energy sector. We try and still make oil from coal, and we run most of our electricity stations on coal. There's little sign of that changing. There are signs of real attempts to make inroads into that structure, but without actually changing the structure itself. So you have a number of green fields, attempts to encourage environmentally friendly initiatives, solar paneling, and small things often tied to job creation strategies coming out as part of the industrial strategy, which Rob Davies is in charge of. But it's fiddling around the edges, really. Very little sign of it. The cost of this on people's lives is extraordinary, just on the health levels, and I'm not just talking people who end up working in mines or around them, but even in the center of Durban, for example, people living around oil refineries and so on. It's one of the great, I think, acknowledged tragedies of being poor in South Africa. On the agricultural production side, there's a good paper of John Sender's coming out. I'll give you the reference during coffee or lunch, which looks precisely at this. Let me just sketch very briefly. The trends are across all agricultural sectors. The extent to which South Africa has failed to capitalize on this massive opening of markets around the world for, certainly for processed agricultural goods, is quite shocking. John looks, for example, at pineapple, processed pineapples, fruit juices, and so on. And we have a smaller share of the global market in fruit juice than we had 20, 30 years ago right now. And yet the opportunities were there because we know they're out there, because we look at what happened to a country like China, for example, which completely just took over that market. Cut flowers, there was an industry in South Africa. We're not in the game anymore. Who's in the game? Ethiopia. We all know Kenya, but Ethiopia is in the game. So there's a number of really stark examples of South African capitalism at this level, which is still quite big, because it is agribusiness, just failing or refusing to take these gaps. And I think a big part of it is they just don't see it as being profitable enough for them, and they've moved their money into other sectors or moved it out of the country. You're right. I don't think the farmers going elsewhere is as big a factor, but I might be wrong about that. Something else John touches on, and this is controversial, he's not terribly fond of the land reform model as it's played out. And a point he makes, which I find quite persuasive, and I put this out to you as a provocation, is that one of the principles of this model, and South Africa is not alone in this, is this idea that you need to help small farmers to have a plot of land and give them the various support infrastructure and systems so they can make a go of it, at least feed their own family and then sell on a surplus, and that if there's a strategy that they can tap into, they can grow and become a viable business and so on. Well, John's research finds no evidence of this happening. The research was Eastern Cape Province focused. On the contrary, the percentage of so-called independent farmers, African farmers, capable of feeding themselves is so small that you feel like weeping. They have to go and work in order to feed themselves, and yet they are farmers in that.
Okay, I've got one more round, and we'll have a brief coffee. This is going to be an intense day, and then we'll have the second panel. Yes, could you introduce yourself?
My name is Richard Marais, and you didn't talk about something which I was a little bit surprised. Keeping in mind the paragraph, especially the last sentence of the second paragraph you read, I want to talk about BEE, Black Economic Empowerment. Do you think that it was in connection with that paragraph, or it was one of those objectives? Number one question, and number two, did the objectives of the BEE were met or are not being met?
Suzanne.
Thank you both so much for your. Suzanne Clausen, Carleton University, and thank you. I love both your presentations. I wanted to follow up, Hein, on your comment that the upcoming municipal elections are going to be "quote unquote" eye-opening, and hear you talk a little bit more about that. When I go to South Africa, which is about once a year, I'm always struck by the palpable rage that you're describing at the material reality in South Africa today, and yet the ongoing support for the ANC at the polls, although it is declining. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about what you think may happen with this anger. Like, who do you think is leading it and steering it in a progressive direction, if anyone? I mean, there was the Rempele moment. I don't know what happened to that after that fell apart. Is there anything interesting happening there? Do you think the change that we need to see happen will happen within the ANC because they still are the only game in town, or is there something happening outside the party that you can sort of point to us? to look for. And Dan, I include you in on that because even though you don't want to discuss South Africa today, you basically said you don't think Malema's fascist message is going to, ultimately succeed. So any thoughts on from both of you would be great.
Maureen Sachs, School of Social Work here. I left Malabili land in Zimbabwe a year after independence when the university started to be dismantled, is no other way of describing it. You two are the boots on the ground, so I'm really interested. We always used to look at South African universities and their academic work in agriculture, medicine, and so forth as, the pièce de résistance for us. So I really want to hear from both of you about, are the universities still advising? Are they still functioning? Hein, you mentioned school enrollment has gone up. Maybe I misheard that, but has university enrollment gone up, gone down? I'm really interested because you would know you're there.
At the back.
No, thanks. Thanks.
Can you introduce yourself, sir? Can we have your name? Okay.
From South Africa. Actually, my question is related to what the gentleman who just took picture. It is in relation with the issue of the flow of trade or the illicit movement of flow of finances. Last year, for instance, there were reports to the effect that there are billions, to the amount of 60 billions of rands that have flown from Africa to the developed countries. Now, I want to answer to relate it to the diagnosis of the challenges that are experienced in South Africa. Because my observation, for instance, from the presentation that we had, both presentations, mainly targeting on the managers of the state, which is the ANC, whilst on the other fact, the capital itself has not been presented as one of the biggest challenges. Because one of the biggest challenges is as what also Mr. Pradet has indicated, the issue of black economic empowerment, which South Africans themselves, I understand that they took a decision that, of course, based on the dynamics and the challenges that are experienced in South Africa, there has to be some policies and strategies that they should adopt, including, of course, the issue of black economic empowerment, which in various circles that it has been branded as not successful. But also it's important that you also reflect on that. How is your assessment? But the South Africans themselves have taken some decision to move forward and address the challenges that they experience. For instance, myself, I'm coming from the rural area of Lisibisi. Previously, for the past 300 years during the Apartheid, there was no electricity, there was no water, and today, in fact, today I can confirm that in my village there is water, there is electricity, there are clinics. Now, contrary to that, there is also, I'll just conclude, linked to that, there is this movement of funds, of money, of finances from the whole of Africa, not only South Africa, but throughout.
Over here.
Who's steering the protest energies in a potentially progressive direction? Nobody, frankly. I mean, it goes back to the early 2000s when this trend started already. There have been attempts to do it in particular areas, and I'm not aware of any market success in it thus far. It speaks to a series of failures, which I can bore you with at coffee time, but I think it is, we keep being told about this great rebellious energy that's there, and certainly it seems to be there, but until it it acquires some kind of tactical and strategic pattern, it's going to be just that, and that's partly why it can be used so opportunistically as well. How this all shows up in 2016, I really have no idea. I think one way is possibly an even lower than usual turnout at the polls is likely, but I think you're going to have to almost look at the places where strange parties win. It's going to almost require focusing on a particular few areas that look to have potential for drama and see what happens. Because a lot of the drama is not going to be evident in the votes, it's going to be what happens before then. Who stands on what ticket and so on. It's boring minutiae, but it's fascinating when you're trying to understand what's happening.
I meant to add to my question, do you think the casting of Mandela will have any meaningful, nothing? No, okay.
The universities, I'm not an academic, and I say it with a certain degree of envy and pride at the same time. But I know lots of academics, and they've struggled because, like in Canada, the model of managing academic institutions is effectively follow the Anglo model, which is a new liberal one. So classroom sizes are bigger than ever. Yes, enrollment is up. But it's tougher for people to actually teach properly, and it's very difficult to raise the money to do things like have a conference like this without having to go and fundraise and so on. So it's a tough life out there. The quality of graduates is another issue, and that really depends on the discipline that you're working in. There are certain disciplines that have maintained a very, very high standard of graduates, and there are others that I think struggle to turn out the kinds of students that they genuinely feel proud of. Of course, the measurement models implied by the management do not necessarily reflect these realities. They look at a few other indicators. I'm sure you're aware of that. Finally, the capital flows and the role of capital is something I touched on in the first part of my presentation. And just to reiterate, there is a massive degree of capital flight from South Africa, and I think both of us talked about the importance of South African capital repeatedly in our presentation. But there's a massive liberty that South African businesses have to move capital abroad, some of it legal. We have removed capital controls 30 times since 1994. It is possible for a South African now to move money abroad in ways that were unthinkable 20 years ago. And this wasn't done because people weren't thinking hard enough. The people taking these decisions within the ANC were in some ways convinced, and some ways I think believed, that in fact this would enable South African corporations to restructure, recapitalize abroad, because they were stuck with businesses, large parts of which made no sense in any strategic way whatsoever, to recapitalize abroad and reinvest back in South Africa again. Well, guess what? The first part happened, the second part didn't. Right? So what we've had is then this desperate attempt to try and keep money coming in because you needed to balance your books. And we've kept removing capital controls to allow money to come in and leave the country, more or less at will. So our capital flows are very, very volatile. They are attracted by high interest rates and a number of other not terribly helpful indicators in the economy, and so on. The last question you had was capital as a challenge. It's a fundamentally important challenge, but I think the important thing is to put it together with the political decision making that happens. The one doesn't happen independent of the other. We have a political economy in South Africa, and it's out of this mix of these two worlds. The way in which they come together in the state, I think, is fundamental to understand why we have the kind of reality we just described. Just finally, I have to defend myself on this. Right at the beginning, I'm not sure whether you were present, Dan did the same. I make a point of saying what has changed in South Africa, and it's enormous. There's absolutely no denying this fact in there. I take that as a given. I think what's interesting is to understand why more hasn't happened, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, again, thank you for very interesting questions. As briefly as possible on Black Economic Empowerment, BEE, I'll reread the last sentence. In our land, this national question cannot be effectively tackled unless the basic wealth and the basic resources are at the disposal of the people as a whole and not manipulated by sections or individuals, be they white or black, No, the BEE hasn't resolved that question and can't. It's not a strategy to resolve that question. It's a strategy to open up the privileges of the South African system, which date back 350-something years, to people who were previously excluded on the basis of color. And one of the criteria of that opening up is access to or connections with the party in power. BEE is the ANC's attempt to say that it's addressing the economic inequalities in South Africa, and it's clearly, as far as I'm concerned, not working. And if you do an analysis, I don't have the data with me, and I'm sure Hein can reply to this better than I can, of the 2 to 3 million people who have now benefited very substantially. Their life circumstances have radically changed. They've gone from amongst the poorest to amongst the richest people on the planet in a very short period. To them, yes, this has been a monumental change, but this is not what in the old days we would have called a productive bourgeoisie. It's not a group of people who are finding new ways, and the best book on this was written by Mletsi Mbeki, the brother of the former president, which shows that exactly BEE is not creating new wealth in South Africa, it's simply recirculating existing wealth. Second point on the universities, well, my boots are not on the ground, they're actually in Quebec. So I'm not going to talk about the universities today, but I do want to talk about the universities during the apartheid period, because part of the discourse about the so-called decline in standards in South African universities rests on a monumental fallacy about what South African universities are. I mean the so-called best South African universities. I was trained at one and taught at another. What they were like in the 1960s. They, apart from the faculties of medicine and engineering, and more particularly mining engineering, and most particularly at the University of the Witwatersrand, those faculties were sustained by private enterprise. Those were world-class faculties in the sense that they were training professionals with abilities that were recognized worldwide. In the social sciences, the humanities, the general sciences, the training was fifth rate, absolutely fifth rate. When I did my BA in the University of Witwatersrand, in my 4 years of the BA and BA honors, I had one professor who had a doctorate, and not one who had ever published. So I did 2 degrees at the university, and this was the norm. When I taught at the University of Natal, Durban as it then was, same thing. I was privileged to teach with 2 fantastic people, Rick Turner and Michael Newpin, but the standards were exceptionally low. So there is a myth in white South Africa that there were these glorious universities. I mean, they were pathetic. Unfortunately, they were far better. They were far better than the sort of second-tier white universities, and infinitely better than what were called at the time the Bush colleges. So the baseline was very low, except in these 2 faculties. To answer Suzanne's question, what is happening with all the anger? Well, I think your question presumes that anger has to go somewhere. We are living in a stage of human history where most human beings are extruded from the benefits of global capitalism, and they have nowhere to go. And the rise of so-called terrorism is exactly a direct product of that. I mean, it is the absolute frustration with a failed promise of modernity, with a failed promise that education changes your life. This is not the case in a very small job market. And unless on a global scale humanity is able to address this problem, I don't think we're going to go anywhere. So the fact that there's anger does not necessarily mean that it's going to translate into anything significant. And I want to mention Quebec again, because in 2012 there was a massive popular movement in Quebec. It wasn't just students. It was massive. I mean, the so-called casserole, or the people who came out in the street and kept me awake because they went in front of my door banging on pots. Everybody had, as we say in South Africa, gatful. And I won't translate what that means for those who don't know, but it means we'd haven't had enough. There was massive social rage. It led to the defeat, narrow defeat, of the Shari government. Pauline Marais was elected on a promise of taxing the wealthy and freezing fees at the universities, and a whole series of other programs. She did a 180-degree turn within 3 weeks. And guess what? Philippe Couillard is now the Premier of Quebec with a much worse social program, and anything Jean Charest had ever envisaged. So this brings me back to the question raised by John. It's not enough to build a social movement. The Quebec social movement was incredibly impressive. It's not enough even to win an election if there's not a strategy of power and transformation, a clear understanding how power works, and it's in the state. I mean, we can, post-structuralists can go on and on as much as they like about the state being less significant than it used to be. There is no way around the state, even though it's changed dramatically. Unless angry people can do that, there will remain anger. There will remain what we call anomic violence. Our lives will become more and more difficult, less difficult than those who extruded from the system. Most people here are not. But it seems to me that it's a fallacy to think just because there's anger that it somehow must necessarily translate into action. It often doesn't do so.
I'm just wondering if anyone's...
Okay, just hold it. Hein wants to come back in.
But I just wanted to share an anecdote, and it speaks to the new black economic elite. In the Marais film last night, towards the end, those of you who saw it, you recall the spot where Cyril Ramaphosa says, but you have to understand that even though we sit on these boards, we really don't have any say. And I think that's a moment of self-excusing, self-exculpating honesty, which is quite startling to have a person sit there and tell you that. I'm still actually working for the boss here.
With $700 million.
With $700 million, that's why he's there working for the boss. But that is the reality of black economic empowerment. Not only that it's not productive in the sense of changing the realities of workers and would-be workers, but that it doesn't even seem capable of shifting the course of major entrepreneurial decision-making off this path-dependent one that it's on.
On your behalf, I'd like to thank both speakers for a very stimulating. 15 minutes for coffee, and then we'll come back at 25 minutes.